Well, the nightmare scenario is that the Conservative Party only just make it into double figures. I think that's highly unlikely, but it's not altogether impossible. I think the worst case scenario is around 15 seats for the Tories, but I would have thought they'd be hoping to get nearer 20. I think if they manage to get over 20, and remember they got, I think it was 26 in 2009, then I think they will be able to spin that as, okay, difficult, but by no means disastrous. It's going to be, I guess, easier for them to do that if Labour comes second to UKIP. And this is possible if they manage to win as many or maybe even more seats than Nigel Farage, because of course the electoral system, because it's regionally divided, doesn't necessarily, of course, mean that a party's national vote share will be translated into a seat share across the whole country. So I think partly the difficulties for the Conservative Party will depend on quite how bad the numbers are in terms of seats. Obviously, everybody will be making projections in terms of what does this mean in a general election in terms of the vote share, but I think the seat share will also be quite important for the response. So what will happen, particularly if UKIP finish at number 1? Well, as I say in the briefing paper, I think there won't necessarily be bloodletting, but there will obviously be bedwetting. There are going to be calls, as Rick said, for the leadership to harden its stance on the EU and in particular to harden its stance on immigration. I think those are going to be very, very difficult things for David Cameron to do, because one of the points I want to make is that the domestic and the diplomatic now are so closely interwoven that Cameron has a real problem. He can perhaps say he's hardening the position on immigration, particularly with regard to benefits. This is what normally happens with the Conservatives and has happened over the last year or so. Anytime UKIP have seemed particularly threatening, we have, and you will know this, number 10 briefing and sometimes actually action in terms of legislative proposals on migrants. So that might be possible, but in terms of what he can do to harden his position on the EU, that's very, very difficult, because as you well know, Cameron wants to keep things fairly non-specific. He doesn't want to outline a shopping list. He doesn't want to be pushed by his backbenchers into doing that. He's come up with 7 supposedly very specific things he wants out of the renegotiation. As you all know, if you look at them, they're not really very specific at all. And it's hard to think of what else he can actually say he is going to go for without his interlocutors in Europe saying, that's too difficult, that's impossible, and therefore embarrassing him in that respect. So I think the pressure's going to come on Cameron, but it's difficult to see what he can sort of pull out that he hasn't already pulled out in that respect. So the obvious alternative, or possibly complementary route for Cameron is a reshuffle, as we all know, that's coming up. Possibly the sacrificial lamb will be Grant Shapps. He may be moved and someone more presentable or tough or high profile brought in to do that. And that might well apply as well to the cabinet. It may be possible to find more media-friendly, more kind of ordinary, if you like, Tories and bring them into the shadow cabinet, partly in order to do something about the perception among people more generally, but also particularly among those who are attempting to vote for UKIP, that the Conservative Party's kind of lost touch with them and doesn't represent them. There is no kind of Norman Tebbit, if you like, among the current cabinet. Now, your guess is as good as mine as to who will be brought in. I'm not saying that Mike Penning is going to replace George Osborne, for example, but it could be. It's not beyond the wildest imagination that David Davis, for example, is brought back in some role, maybe just a campaigning one, and there are other people sort of bubbling under the cabinet who may make an appearance in the cabinet after the reshuffle, in an attempt to do something about this kind of out-of-touch, effete, metrosexual image that Cameron and his cabinet has. And it's interesting, if you look at UKIP sympathisers among Conservative Party members, which is something we've done some research on, it's very clear that Cameron is the real problem for them. You know, the distance between those people who attempted to vote for UKIP and Cameron is very big, you know, socially, ideologically, whatever. So doing something about that might help. It's also possible, of course, that you know, Cameron will be able to spin the whole thing as the real losers of this election being Labour and the Liberal Democrats. That's going to be possible, clearly, if the Liberal Democrats finish beneath the Greens, which is, again, not unrealistic now, and if Labour finish second to UKIP, as I've already said. There may be something even more dramatic that Cameron can do, not necessarily collapse the coalition, but make it very, very clear, more clear than he has done already, that perhaps he sees the coalition ending rather sooner than some people suspect, or rather more distance anyway being drawn between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, not just some half-assed comment about some little black book that he's got of Conservative policies, but making it very much more clear the distinction between the Conservatives and the Liberal Democrats, and doing that by separating, if you like, perhaps rather further from the election and closer to it than people suspect at the moment. Really, I mean, Cameron's gambit is going to have to be to play for time in the hope that the domestic economic recovery gradually begins to kind of feed into some kind of, not necessarily feel-good factor, but feel not quite so bad factor in time for the election, and to hope that that actually persuades some people currently enamoured of UKIP to return to the Tory fold. But as Jane said, and Rob Ford and Matt Goodwin and Rick emphasised, it's unclear actually as to whether you can answer what is in some ways a sort of social and cultural problem with an economic answer. So we'll see that. There are two aspects I just want to kind of bring up before finishing. One is a kind of pre-election aspect, and one is a post-election aspect. The first one is in some ways probably the least important, and that is the European election campaign, at least in Europe anyway, is being fought in part by the list leaders of the various European party groups, and you may or may not have seen them debate each other on television. It's not something that's getting any, if much, airplay in the UK. However, it does matter because I think that clearly it may be that one of those candidates is going to be the next Commission President. You can't be sure of that, and it could be the candidate for the EPP, Juncker. Now, I think it is quite important that the Conservative MPs and MEPs, if they are kind of doing some Brussels bashing, don't go too far in bashing the EPP's candidate. Clearly they're not in the EPP themselves, but I do think that they have to be careful not to so irritate other centre-right leaders by their rhetoric. It makes things more difficult for Cameron, and it makes things more difficult for Britain diplomatically, should Juncker eventually get the post. He may not. The second thing is more important, and I think it is something that's definitely worth flagging up, and that is a post-election aspect. Now, it's clear that the Conservative Party's group in the European Parliament, the European Conservatives and Reformists, are going to have trouble reforming in their current configuration. Because the Czech party in there is going to be probably wiped out, not necessarily completely, but pretty much so. Some of the sort of single-member parties that they've got are going to disappear. The Polish should do reasonably well there, but the Conservatives themselves obviously will be considerably denuded. Now, that group needs 25 MEPs from 7 different member states, at least if the current rules apply in the next European Parliament. That means that the ECR is going to be desperately looking around Europe, scouring every single member state for reasonably respectable Eurosceptic centre-right / right-wing parties. Now, a very obvious candidate to include will be, presuming it makes it into the European Parliament, the Alternative for Deutschland. Okay, this new sort of, in relative terms anyway, Eurosceptic party from Germany, which, given that the threshold in Germany is going to be reduced, will probably make it into the European Parliament. They are a really obvious candidate for the ECR. I mean, they should be in there on any measure. However, it is very, very clear, if you listen to people from Angela Merkel's party, the CDU, that they will take a very dim view of it being invited into the ECR, because it will give that party legitimacy and credibility that they want to deny it, because they do see it as a threat. They hope it will disappear, they hope it will implode, but they do see it potentially anyway as a threat to the CDU, CSU. And the CDU, CSU, the Christian Democrats in Germany, have always been incredibly successful in preventing any competitor on their right flank. They really do not want to see the Alternativa come in and be lent legitimacy by the Conservatives inviting them into their group. Okay? And they have made this clear in private to the Conservatives. However, there will be Conservative MEPs, there will be Conservative MPs who want to make the ECR work and may actually try and pressure Cameron into doing that. That, I think, just to end, shows, as we're saying, this fascinating, inextricable linkage now between the diplomatic and the domestic, and it's something we can't afford to when we think about this election, because clearly it's interesting both in and of itself. It's interesting because it's got a value as an indicator of what's going to happen at the next general election, but it also actually matters as well to this country's ability to negotiate its way through what's going to be a very difficult relationship, I think, with the European Union in a few years to come.
Thank you. Right, questions?